Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. You know, we always appreciate you sending in material, and you've given us quite a bit to think about this time.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot to unpack here.
Lots to dig into.
Especially around this whole 20th anniversary of the PRC's Anti-Secession Law and all the discussions that's been sparking.
It's been everywhere.
Yeah, and this YouTube video featuring明居正that a lot of you sent our way, it's a perfect example. So really our mission for this deep dive is to go beyond just the headlines and really try to understand the core of what's being said here.
Right, the nuance.
The nuance, the arguments, and the different perspectives that are out there.
Yeah, because there's a lot of different ways to interpret this, a lot of angles.
Absolutely. And this source material, this video, really dives into some pretty significant areas. We're talking about the PRC's view of Taiwan, this sensitive issue of alleged infiltration, and then all the different reactions to recent political statements that have been made.
Yeah, some pretty strong opinions out there.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so where do we even start with all of this?
Well, I think what immediately struck me is just how directly the speaker in the video, Mingju Sheng, addresses these issues. He doesn't shy away from some really delicate topics.
No, he definitely doesn't.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most attention-grabbing parts is when he starts talking about this alleged PRC infiltration in Taiwan. He really paints a picture of it being widespread and deeply concerning.
Yeah, he does. And it goes way beyond just the usual suspects, right? I mean, we're talking about businesses, political figures, even their aides, media outlets, religious organizations like temples.
Wow.
But then it takes an even more serious turn when he brings up the military.
Oh, yeah. That's where it gets really heavy.
Yeah.
He talks about active duty military personnel, not just retired folks, potentially being compromised.
Exactly. And he doesn't just speak in generalities. He actually gives specific examples, like these alleged plans to fly helicopters right up to the median line and essentially hand them over.
Yeah, I remember that part.
And then there's the potential compromise of classified military intelligence, like the deployment of aircraft, their flight paths, altitudes, all that.
All very specific stuff.
Right. And he suggests that this could be happening through compromised personnel in battle control. If true, that's a huge vulnerability.
Absolutely. And, you know, it really makes you stop and think when he throws those questions out to the listener. Questions like, do you really believe that this level of infiltration is happening? And if the PRC's intentions are truly peaceful, why would they even be engaging in these kinds of activities?
Yeah, those questions really get to the heart of the issue, don't they? The trust, the motives, it's all up for debate.
It is. And that analogy he uses about not distinguishing between friend and foe, it just highlights this fear that Taiwan might be unknowingly harboring elements that could undermine its own security.
It's a powerful analogy. It points to this blurring of lines, this sense of vulnerability, and it leads us right into the next controversial point. This whole debate about whether it's accurate or appropriate to characterize the PRC as an external hostile force.
Yeah, that's a hot button issue for sure. And he alludes to the backlash that followed when, current leaders in Taiwan use that very phrase to describe the PRC.
Right. And some people argue that using that kind of language is only going to make things worse, that it undermines any chance of dialogue or peaceful resolution.
And they even point to historical examples to make their point, like the interactions between Sima Yi and Zhu Jiang.
Oh, yeah. And then there's Ho Jing and Liu Yang. These were all situations where communication was maintained even during wartime, even between adversaries. And they say that this is proof that it's always possible to keep those channels open.
Right, that even in the midst of conflict, dialogue can be a valuable tool. And they bring up the Trump-Xi meeting as a more modern example, where dialogue was deemed necessary despite very significant disagreements.
Absolutely. But, Mingbu Zhang, the speaker in the video, he offers a pretty strong counterargument to that whole line of reasoning.
Oh, yeah, he does. And his counterargument is basically, it's not really about what we think. It's about how the PRC itself defines the relationship.
Right. And he puts it right back on those who criticize the hostile force label. He's basically saying, okay, if you don't think that's an accurate description, then tell me, what does the PRC consider this cross-strait relationship to be?
Exactly. And according to him, and to Beijing's own pronouncements, the answer is pretty clear. An unfinished civil war.
Right. So from the PRC's perspective, Taiwan is not a separate entity. It's a rebellious province that needs to be brought back into the fold.
So it's an internal matter for them. And that's where his accusations against those who object to the hostile force label come in.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't hold back. He uses some pretty strong language, like double standards.
Yeah. And then there's that really charged phrase, eating Taiwan's rice and helping outsiders.
essentially accusing them of being traitors.
Strong words.
Definitely. And he goes on to try and explain why he thinks some people in Taiwan are more accepting of the PRC's rhetoric while being quick to criticize those who express concerns. He talks about brainwashing and pressure as possible reasons, but he seems to lean more towards the brainwashing side.
And then he shifts gears a little bit and starts talking about the motivations of some within the blue camp, which is generally associated with the KMT, the Kuomintang.
Right.
He suggests that their desire for closer ties with the PRC might be driven by recent electoral losses, and this idea that the KMT has historically suffered after aligning with the CCP even brings up the Northern Expedition and the War of Resistance against Japan as examples.
Yeah, he's making a historical argument there. He's saying that these past events show a pattern where cooperation between the KMT and CCP ultimately backfired on the KMT, leaving them weaker or at a disadvantage.
And he's drawing a parallel to the current situation, suggesting that maybe history is repeating itself. Okay, so moving on, he then gets into his rationale for why Taiwan needs to take a tougher stance against these perceived threats, and he uses an analogy involving Trump to illustrate his point.
Okay, so how does Trump fit into all of this?
Well, he explains it like this. You know how some on the left really criticized Trump's actions, saying that he was being divisive when he pushed back against what he saw as a distorted political reality?
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, he says that efforts in Taiwan to counter PRC influence might be met with similar accusations of being divisive. But his point is, if one side is acting aggressively or deceptively, then taking a stronger stance to address that is justified, even if it ruffles some feathers.
So he's advocating for a more assertive approach from Taiwan.
Exactly. And then he really drives that point home with a very direct message to the listener. He basically says, look, if you disagree with the hostile force designation, then you've been brainwashed very thoroughly, and you need to seriously consider whether your views are truly in the best interests of the ROC.
Wow, he really doesn't mince words, does he?
Not at all. So the discussion then shifts to the more strategic side of things. Were these strong statements made in consultation with the U.S. or other regional partners? And was there any assessment of the potential risk of war?
Yeah, those are important questions. And his argument is that the threat is already very real and very significant. He points to the rapid sharing of intelligence with the PRC as evidence of this. So from his perspective, taking a proactive stance isn't about increasing the risk, it's about acknowledging and responding to an existing and serious threat.
So it's a necessary wake-up call for Taiwan.
That's his take. And he stresses that Taiwan isn't acting in a vacuum. He says they're actually aligned with major world powers on this, and he even brings up past statements by the U.S. Secretary of State about PRC influence within the U.S. itself.
This supports his point.
Exactly. And then he makes this interesting comparison to the U.S.-China relationship. He says that the PRC has been using these underhanded tactics against the U.S. for decades, and that Trump's actions were a long overdue pushback against that.
And he's drawing a parallel to what Taiwan is starting to do now.
Right. And his rhetorical question, why is it wrong to resist aggression? It really highlights his core argument.
It does. Okay, so let's move on to the Anti-Secession Law, which, as we said earlier, just marked its 20th anniversary. Now, the speaker in the video has a very specific take on the primary purpose of this law, and it's not necessarily the interpretation you always hear. He argues that it wasn't solely intended to deter Taiwanese independence, but also served as a way for Beijing to control its own military.
Now, that's an interesting angle.
Yeah. And he specifically points to Article 8 of the law, which outlines those 3 conditions under which non-peaceful means could be used against Taiwan. He suggests that this was partly a response to pressure from PLA generals on Hu Jintao back then.
So he's saying the law had a dual purpose, external deterrence and internal control. Fascinating.
And he contends that military action against Taiwan is not a simple decision for the PRC to make. There are major geopolitical considerations, especially concerning Japan and the U.S., and the risks are high.
That makes sense. It's a complex situation with a lot of moving parts.
And then he throws out another interesting idea, that maybe the PLA actually used the Anti-Secession Law as a way to leverage more resources for themselves.
Oh, so it's like a bureaucratic power play.
Kind of, yeah. A more indirect explanation for why the law came about when it did. Okay, and lastly, he talks about how the statements from the AIT director seem to align with Taiwan's current direction.
Right.
And he sees this as a sign of a strategic understanding between the U.S. and Taiwan, even if there hasn't been explicit communication about it. He seems convinced that the U.S. and Trump in particular, understand Taiwan's crucial role as a first line of defense against the PRC.
I see. And then he brings back that prediction he made earlier about a potential evil axis between the PRC and Russia and how it relates to the tensions in the Taiwan Strait.
And his overall message in this part of the discussion is that Taiwan needs to really understand the global landscape, position itself strategically, and work closely with major democracies.
It's a call to action for sure.
It is. Okay, so let's take a step back for a second and just recap what we've covered here. We talked about those pretty serious allegations of PRC infiltration across different sectors in Taiwan.
Right. From businesses to the military.
Exactly. And we talked about their whole debate over whether it's accurate or fair to call the PRC a hostile force.
And how the PRC itself views the relationship as an unfinished civil war.
Right. And then we got into the strategic considerations behind Taiwan's current stance, the risks involved, different interpretations of the Anti-Secession Law.
And those perceived alignments between Taiwan and the U.S.
A lot to digest, I know. But it's important stuff. So now we turn it over to you, our listeners. What are your thoughts? What stood out to you as the most crucial points in all of this? What possible consequences do you see arising from these different viewpoints on cross-strait relations?
It's a complex landscape with no easy answers.
It really is. So one final thought for you to consider. Based on what you've heard, what do you believe are the most critical factors that Taiwan needs to keep in mind as it navigates this relationship with the PRC in the years to come? And what does this particular perspective tell us about the broader dynamics of international relations, how nations assess threats, and how they respond?
It's a lot to think about.
It is. And that's what the Deep Dive is all about. Thanks for joining us.